The medieval town is still asleep when the church bell begins to ring for the dead. While most people remain behind their wooden doors, you are already awake, preparing for another body that must be washed before it is carried to the grave. Your room is small, cold, and almost empty, with only a wooden basin, a few pieces of worn cloth, buckets, soap, and the tools you use for your work. You are a corpse washer, a person whose job begins where everyone else's ends. When someone dies, families may refuse to touch the body, especially when death has come suddenly or through disease. That is when they call you. You enter houses where the air is heavy with grief, where candles burn beside beds, relatives whisper prayers, and the dead lie motionless beneath rough blankets. You wash the body, clean the hands and face, comb the hair, close the eyes, and prepare the dead for burial. It sounds simple until you realize where this work takes you. You enter the homes of the poor and the wealthy, the victims of illness and accidents, the old and the young, and sometimes people who have died in terrible circumstances. You must work with cold water during winter, carry heavy buckets through narrow streets, and spend hours in rooms where the smell of death refuses to disappear. You are not a priest and you are not a physician. You cannot save anyone. You only arrive after everything is already over. Some people believe your work is necessary. Others avoid looking at you because they believe anyone who spends so much time around the dead must somehow be contaminated by death itself. Your clothes may carry the smell of soap, smoke, damp cloth, and decay. Children whisper when you pass. Neighbors recognize the buckets you carry. When your door opens, people sometimes already know why you are being called. Yet despite the fear surrounding your profession, families depend on you. Without someone willing to prepare the dead, the body may remain inside the home for hours or even days while relatives argue about what should be done. In a world without modern preservation, refrigeration, or sanitation, time matters. The dead must be prepared quickly. You learn to work quietly because families do not want conversation. You learn when to speak and when to remain silent. You learn how to handle grief without becoming part of it. But every body leaves something behind in your memory, a face you cannot forget, a child's small hand, an old man's wedding ring, a mother who refuses to leave the room while you work. These moments follow you home after the candles have been extinguished and the streets have become silent. And tomorrow, another knock will come at your door. Another family will need you. Another body will be waiting. This is the miserable life of a medieval corpse washer. The first morning begins before sunrise, when the church bell rings slowly through the cold streets of the medieval town. You wake in your small wooden room and immediately know that someone has died during the night. Nobody has come to knock yet, but the bell tells you enough. You sit beside the bed for a moment, listening to the distant sound, before reaching for the old wooden basin beside the wall. You fill your sack with clean cloth, a small amount of soap, a comb, and the few simple tools you use to prepare the dead. Then you lift 2 empty buckets and step outside. The morning air is cold, and the streets are almost empty. You walk through the narrow lanes toward the church, passing merchants preparing their stalls and servants carrying water from the well. Most people recognize you even if they pretend not to. They know what your buckets mean. You are the person called when someone has died. At the church, a priest is waiting near the entrance. He tells you that a woman from a nearby house died before dawn. She was an elderly widow who had been sick for several days. Her family wants the body prepared before the funeral. You follow the priest through the quiet streets until you reach a small wooden house. Inside, the atmosphere is heavy. Several relatives sit silently near the fire, while candles burn beside the bed. Nobody speaks when you enter. The woman's daughter approaches you and quietly explains that her mother died peacefully. She asks whether you can prepare her for burial. You nod and place your equipment beside the bed. This is the moment when the family leaves the room. They may want to remain nearby, but most people cannot bring themselves to watch the work. You close the door and begin. The room is cold, and the body lies beneath a simple blanket. You carefully remove it and begin preparing the water. There is no warm running water waiting for you. Every bucket has to be carried from the well, and you have to work with whatever the household can provide. You pour the water into the wooden basin and add the small amount of soap you brought with you. Then you begin washing the body carefully, starting with the hands and face. Your movements are slow and respectful. This is not a task you can rush. The family wants their mother to look peaceful when they see her for the final time. You clean her hair, wipe her face, and carefully arrange her clothing. You close her eyes and place her hands together. Outside the room, you can hear quiet crying. The daughter is praying. You continue working without speaking. You have learned that silence is often the kindest thing you can offer. After some time, you open the door and tell the family that they can come inside. The daughter approaches the bed and immediately begins to cry. She touches her mother's hand and thanks you quietly. You step aside and allow them a few moments together. These moments are difficult even after years of doing this work. You have learned not to become attached, but you are still human. Every death reminds you that one day someone may be standing beside your own bed. After the family finishes their prayers, you wrap the body in clean cloth and help prepare it for the funeral. The priest returns and begins saying prayers while you carry the used water outside. You empty it far from the house and wash your hands at the well. The cold water burns your fingers. You scrub them repeatedly, even though you know the dirt is not the only thing you are trying to remove. When you finish, the family gives you a few coins for your work. It is not much, but you accept it because you still need food. You collect your empty buckets and begin walking home. The town is much busier now. Children run through the streets, merchants shout about their goods, and carts move between the buildings. Nobody notices that you have just spent the morning preparing a dead woman for burial. To them, you are simply another worker returning from a job. As you walk, you pass the cemetery beside the church. The funeral procession has not arrived yet, but several graves are already being prepared. You stop for a moment and look at the fresh earth. You know that later today the woman's body will be placed beneath it. You continue walking, but before you reach home, a young boy approaches you. He asks whether it is true that you wash dead people. You look at him and tell him that someone has to do it. The boy immediately runs away. You are used to that reaction. By the time you return to your room, your back is aching from carrying the buckets, and your hands are red from the cold water. You place the few coins on the table and begin cleaning your equipment. You have barely finished when there is another knock at the door. You stop and look toward it. For a moment, you hope it is only a neighbor. Then you hear a man's voice from outside asking whether you are the corpse washer. You close your eyes for a second before answering. Your first body of the day is barely buried, and another family is already waiting for you. The second day begins only a few hours after you returned home, because the man who knocked on your door was not simply asking for help with a single body. His brother had died suddenly during the night, and the family wanted you to prepare him before the priest arrived. You take your basin, cloth, soap, and buckets once again, even though you have barely rested. The man leads you through the narrow streets to a small house near the edge of the town. When you enter, you immediately notice the difference from yesterday. There are no quiet prayers or peaceful candles. The family is frightened. The dead man had been healthy only a few days earlier, and nobody understands what happened to him. His wife stands near the doorway, refusing to come closer, while his older brother waits beside the bed. You ask what illness he had, but they can only tell you that he developed a fever and became weak very quickly. You do not have the knowledge of a physician, but you have spent enough time around the dead to know that sudden deaths make people afraid. You ask everyone to leave the room before you begin. They hesitate but eventually step outside. You close the door and prepare the water. The room is warmer than yesterday, and the smell is already beginning to change. You work carefully, washing the hands, face, and body while trying not to think about how recently the man was alive. You clean his hair and arrange his clothing, then cover him with a fresh cloth. Every movement has to be respectful because the family will remember the way he looked when they last saw him. When you finally open the door, his wife enters slowly. She looks at him for several seconds before touching his hand. Her fear disappears for a moment, replaced by grief. She thanks you, and you quietly leave the room so the family can pray. Outside, you empty the used water and wash your hands. A neighbor watches you from across the street. When you notice her staring, she quickly turns away. You have become accustomed to this. People want your service, but they do not want to stand too close to you. Some believe that death follows people who spend too much time around corpses. Others believe that the smell of death itself can make a person sick. You know that some illnesses can spread, even if you do not understand how, so you are always careful. You wash your hands, clean your equipment, and avoid touching your face while working. But there are limits to what you can protect yourself from. After receiving your payment, you return toward the center of town. You are tired, but there is another task waiting. A wealthy merchant has sent someone to find you. His father has died, and the family wants the body prepared before a large funeral. When you arrive at the merchant's house, you immediately notice how different the place is from the homes you normally enter. The walls are covered with expensive cloth, the floors are cleaner, and several servants are moving around the rooms. Yet death has made the entire house quiet. The merchant takes you into a private room and explains that his father died peacefully in his sleep. He wants everything done perfectly. You nod and begin preparing the body. Even here, the work is the same. Water must be carried. Cloth must be washed. The body must be cleaned and arranged. Wealth cannot change the nature of death. While you work, you hear the family discussing the funeral outside. They are already talking about the food, the guests, the priest, and the grave. You continue silently, thinking about how quickly a person's life becomes a list of arrangements after they die. When you finish, the merchant enters the room. He looks at his father for a long time and then thanks you. He gives you more coins than you normally receive in several days. You accept them, but the money does not make the work easier. As you leave the house, you see several servants carrying large containers of water. You realize that the family used almost as much water preparing for the funeral as they would normally use in several days. You continue walking through the town as evening approaches. The church bells begin ringing again. Another funeral is taking place. You pass the cemetery and see the grave from yesterday now covered with fresh earth. The woman you prepared that morning is already beneath it. You stop briefly, then continue toward home. You are exhausted, but before you reach your door, you hear someone calling your name. A man is standing in the street with a worried expression. He tells you that a child in his house has died. You look at the sky and realize that night is approaching. You have already worked since before sunrise, but there will be no rest tonight. You pick up your equipment again and follow him into the darkness. The third day begins before the sun rises, because the child whose death was reported the previous evening must be prepared before the family can begin the funeral prayers. You follow the father through the silent streets, carrying your buckets and wooden basin while the church bell rings somewhere in the distance. When you arrive at the house, you immediately notice that the family is larger than the one you visited the night before. Relatives are gathered in the main room, speaking quietly and crying behind their hands. The mother is sitting beside the bed and refuses to leave her child's side. You understand that this will be different from the other deaths. You gently explain that you need space to prepare the body, but the mother asks if she can stay. You allow her to remain nearby as long as she does not interfere. You enter the room and begin preparing the water. Everything feels unusually quiet. The child lies beneath a simple blanket, and beside the bed are a few small objects that belong to him. A wooden toy, a piece of cloth, and a small pair of shoes sit against the wall. You try not to look at them for too long. Your work requires concentration, but moments like this make it difficult to remain detached. You carefully wash the child's hands and face, clean the hair, and arrange the clothing. The mother watches silently, occasionally wiping her eyes. She asks whether the child looks peaceful. You tell her that he does. It is one of the few comforts you can offer. When you finish, you cover the body and allow the family to come closer. The mother touches the child's face and begins crying again. You step outside and sit near the doorway while they pray. The father eventually comes out and gives you a few coins. He apologizes that it is not much. You tell him not to worry. You know that grief leaves little room for money. Before leaving, you clean your basin and cloth as carefully as possible. You have learned that after every body, your equipment must be cleaned immediately. You do not know exactly how disease travels, but you know that some deaths are followed by more deaths, and you have no desire to bring illness from one house to another. You wash your hands at the well and continue through the town. By midday, another family has already sent for you. This time, the dead man is an elderly craftsman who worked with leather for most of his life. His workshop is attached to his house, and the smell of hides and chemicals fills the air. His sons are preparing the workshop for closure while you enter the room where their father lies. They tell you that he died after several weeks of illness. You prepare the body while listening to the family talk outside. They are discussing who will take over the workshop, what will happen to the tools, and how they will pay for the funeral. You realize that death does not stop the practical problems of life. Even while someone is grieving, the family must continue working, paying debts, and deciding what happens next. After you finish, one of the sons enters the room and quietly thanks you. He asks whether you have become used to seeing dead people. You think about the question for a moment. You tell him that you have become used to the work, but not to death itself. He seems surprised by the answer. You explain that every body is different because every person had a different life. He says nothing after that. In the afternoon, you are called to a small house near the river. A fisherman has died after falling from a boat. When you arrive, several men are gathered outside. They tell you that the body was recovered from the water only a short time ago. You immediately realize that this will be a difficult preparation. The family wants the man to be buried quickly, but they also want him to look as peaceful as possible. You enter the room and begin your work. The water from the river has left the man's clothing soaked and cold. You carefully remove the wet clothes and begin cleaning him. The work takes longer than usual because of the condition of the body. You do not speak while you work. Outside, the man's wife waits with her children. When you finally finish, you arrange his clothing and cover him with a clean cloth. His wife enters and breaks down when she sees him. She thanks you through her tears. You leave the room and wash your hands beside the river. The sun is beginning to disappear, but you still have another message waiting for you. A priest has asked you to prepare several bodies from a nearby village because an illness has begun spreading through the area. You stop when you hear this. You know what that could mean. When several people begin dying from the same sickness, fear spreads faster than any explanation. You consider refusing, but the priest tells you that nobody else is willing to do the work. You look at your worn equipment and realize that tomorrow may be the most dangerous day of your life. You return home late that night, exhausted and worried. You clean your basin, wash your cloths, and place your equipment beside the door. Then you sit in silence, staring at the small amount of money you earned during the day. It is barely enough to pay for food. Yet tomorrow you will have to enter houses where an unknown illness has already taken several lives. You blow out the candle and lie down, but sleep does not come easily. For the first time in many years, you wonder whether preparing the dead might eventually make you one of them. The fourth day begins with you leaving the town before sunrise, following the priest toward the nearby village where several people have died from the same unknown illness. The road is muddy from the previous night's rain, and you carry your basin, clean cloths, soap, and buckets carefully because you know you may need them all. The priest walks ahead in silence. Neither of you speaks much about what is waiting for you. When the village finally appears, you immediately notice how quiet it is. There are no children playing in the streets, few people outside, and several doors are closed even though the morning has already begun. A man meets you near the first house and tells you that his wife died 2 nights earlier. He looks frightened when he asks whether you can prepare her for burial. You enter the house alone. The room is small, poorly ventilated, and still warm from the fire. The woman's body lies beneath a blanket, and beside her are several candles that have almost burned out. You prepare the water and begin your work carefully. You wash her hands and face, clean her hair, and arrange her clothing. While working, you notice signs that she had been very sick before her death. You do not know what caused the illness, but you understand that you must be more careful than usual. You keep your hands away from your face, avoid unnecessary contact with surfaces, and clean your equipment as soon as you finish. When you leave the room, the husband waits outside. He asks whether she looks peaceful. You tell him that she does. He closes his eyes and thanks you quietly. You move to the well and spend several minutes washing your hands and equipment before entering another house. The next body belongs to an older man who died during the night. His family is terrified because his daughter has also developed a fever. The priest tells you that several homes in the village have reported similar symptoms. You begin to understand why nobody wanted to come here. Each house you enter carries the same fear. People stand outside their doors watching you, wondering whether you will eventually be the one carried away. By midday, you have prepared 3 bodies. Your back aches from carrying water, and your hands are beginning to crack from constant washing. You stop beside the church and sit for a few minutes. The priest gives you bread and water and tells you that you can leave if you want. You look toward the village. Several families are still waiting. You know that if you leave, the bodies may remain inside their homes for another day. You pick up your equipment and continue. The 4th house is the most difficult. A young woman has died, leaving behind 2 small children. Her mother is sitting beside the body and refuses to leave the room. She tells you that her daughter was perfectly healthy only a week earlier. You have no answer for her. You simply prepare the water and begin your work. The grandmother watches every movement. When you clean the woman's hair and arrange her clothing, the old woman begins quietly praying. You finish and cover the body with clean cloth. Before leaving, you place the woman's hands together and step back. The grandmother touches her daughter's face and begins to cry. You leave the room without saying anything. Outside, you notice several villagers staring at you. One man whispers that you are carrying death from house to house. Another says that anyone who touches the dead will become sick. You hear the words but do not respond. You know fear makes people say things they would normally never say. Still, the comments follow you as you continue working. By late afternoon, you have prepared several more bodies. Your clean cloths are becoming fewer, your soap is almost gone, and the water from the well is becoming harder to use because everyone in the village needs it. You decide to finish one final house before returning to the church. Inside, you find an elderly couple sitting beside their dead son. The father asks whether you can prepare him so that the family can bury him before nightfall. You agree. When you begin washing the body, you notice how silent the house is. There is no crying, no talking, only the sound of water moving inside the wooden basin. You finish the preparation and step outside. The priest is waiting for you. He tells you that another person has died. You look at your empty buckets and worn equipment. For a moment, you want to refuse. Your body is exhausted, and you are beginning to feel a slight headache. But you know that if you stop now, another family will have to deal with the body themselves. You follow the priest to the final house. As you walk through the darkening village, you notice that several windows have already been closed. People are afraid to come outside. The streets feel abandoned. You enter the house and prepare the final body of the day. When you finish, you wash your hands for a long time, then clean every piece of equipment before leaving. The priest tells you that you have done more than anyone else was willing to do. You do not feel proud. You feel tired. On the way back to town, the road is almost completely dark. You carry your empty buckets while the priest walks beside you. Neither of you speaks. When you finally reach your room, you place your equipment outside and sit down before even removing your coat. Your hands are shaking from exhaustion. You touch your forehead and notice that you feel warmer than usual. For the first time, the fear that you have been ignoring all day becomes impossible to dismiss. You have spent the entire day surrounded by an illness you do not understand, touching bodies that died from it, and now you are beginning to wonder whether you brought something back with you. You lie down without eating and stare into the darkness, listening to the distant church bell. Tomorrow, you will have to decide whether you are strong enough to continue. The fifth day begins with you waking before sunrise, but this time you do not hear the church bell first. You hear your own breathing. Your body feels heavy, your throat is dry, and the headache from the previous night has become stronger. For several minutes you remain lying beneath your thin blanket, wondering whether you should simply stay in bed. Then someone knocks on your door. You already know what they want. Another death has occurred. You slowly get up, wash your face, and prepare your equipment. Your hands are not as steady as usual, but you tell yourself that exhaustion is the reason. Outside, the morning air feels unusually cold. You walk toward the house where you have been called, carrying your basin and buckets through streets that are slowly filling with people. When you arrive, a frightened man opens the door. His wife has died during the night. He asks you to prepare her before the priest arrives. You enter the room and immediately notice that the family is terrified. Nobody wants to touch the body. You begin preparing the water, but your movements are slower than usual. You wash the woman's hands and face, clean her hair, and arrange her clothing while trying to ignore the weakness spreading through your body. When you finish, you step outside and sit beside the wall for a moment. The husband watches you carefully and asks whether you are sick. You tell him that you are only tired. You do not want to frighten him. You wash your hands and equipment and continue toward the next house. By midday, you have already prepared 2 more bodies. Your headache has become stronger, and you feel a strange warmth beneath your clothes despite the cold weather. You stop near the church and drink from your water bottle. The priest notices your condition immediately. He tells you that you should return home and rest. You tell him that there are still families waiting. He argues that if you become sick, you will not be able to help anyone. You finally agree to stop for a few hours. You return home and lie down, but the rest does not help. Your body begins to ache and your skin feels hot. You stare at the ceiling, realizing that you may have brought the village's illness back with you. By evening, another knock comes at your door. You do not answer immediately. The person outside calls your name and tells you that a family needs you. You sit on the edge of your bed, caught between fear and responsibility. Eventually, you open the door. The priest is standing outside. He looks at you and immediately realizes that something is wrong. He tells you that you cannot go. You argue that the family has nobody else. The priest tells you that they will have to wait until morning. For the first time in your life, someone is refusing to let you do your work. You close the door and return to your bed. That night, the fever becomes worse. You drink water and try to sleep, but every time you close your eyes, you remember the houses you visited in the village. You remember the sick families, the bodies you washed, the frightened children standing outside their homes. You begin wondering whether your own work has brought you closer to death than you ever understood. By morning, you are still alive, but your strength is almost gone. The priest visits your room and leaves food beside the bed. He tells you that several more people in the village have died. You ask whether the illness is spreading through the town. He does not know. You spend most of the day resting, but your mind remains occupied by the work you left unfinished. Your equipment is still sitting outside your door. The wooden basin is dirty, the cloths need washing, and the buckets are empty. Normally, you would have cleaned everything immediately. Now you barely have enough strength to stand. Late in the afternoon, you hear a funeral bell, then another. The sound continues for a long time. You realize that the illness is no longer something happening in a distant village. It is moving closer to your own home. As night approaches, your fever finally begins to weaken slightly. You sit up and drink water. Your body still aches, but you can stand. You look toward the equipment beside the door and understand that tomorrow you may have to make a choice. You can remain inside and protect yourself, or you can return to the families who have nobody else willing to prepare their dead. You know exactly what the medieval town expects from you. They do not care whether you are afraid. They only care that when someone dies, you come. You lie back down and close your eyes. Outside, the church bell begins ringing again, announcing another death somewhere in the darkness. The 6th day begins with you finally feeling strong enough to stand, although your body is still weak and your head still aches. You spend the morning sitting beside the small window of your room, watching the town outside. The streets look strangely different. Fewer people are walking through them, several shops remain closed, and the church bell seems to ring more often than usual. You know that the illness has reached the town. By midday, the priest arrives and tells you that 3 more people have died. He does not ask whether you can work. He simply tells you where they are. You look at your equipment beside the door and realize that you cannot stay inside forever. You prepare fresh water, clean cloths, soap, and your wooden basin, then follow him through the quiet streets. The first house belongs to a poor family living in a small wooden room. Their father died during the night, leaving behind his wife and 2 children. The family is terrified of the body, but they also cannot afford to pay much. You enter the room and begin preparing him for burial. Your hands are still weak, so you work slowly. You wash his face and hands, clean his hair, and arrange his clothing. The children remain outside the doorway, watching silently. When you finish, their mother enters and thanks you with tears in her eyes. She gives you only a few coins, but you accept them without complaint. You know she cannot give more. Outside, you wash your hands and equipment before moving to the next house. The second body belongs to a merchant who had been ill for several days. His family has more money, but their fear is exactly the same. His wife refuses to enter the room, and his brother asks you whether the illness can spread through the dead. You tell him that you do not know. You only know that you must be careful. You clean the body, change the cloth, and prepare him for the funeral. When you leave, the merchant's family gives you more money than usual. You put the coins into your pocket and continue walking. By afternoon, you are exhausted again. Your fever has not completely disappeared, and every step feels heavier than it should. Still, another house is waiting. This time, the dead person is an elderly woman who lived alone. Nobody discovered her until a neighbor noticed that she had not opened her door for 2 days. When you enter the house, you find the room cold and silent. There are no relatives waiting outside, no crying children, and no one to ask whether she should be buried in a certain way. You prepare her alone. Afterward, you carefully fold her clothing and place it beside the bed so that whoever comes to collect the body can identify her belongings. Before leaving, you look around the small room. There are only a few possessions: a wooden chair, an old blanket, a cup, and a small religious symbol hanging above the bed. You realize that this woman spent most of her life surrounded by ordinary objects that will now remain without her. You close the door and continue walking. The church bell rings again as you cross the street. You stop for a moment and look toward the church tower. Another funeral is beginning. The town seems to be losing people faster than anyone can bury them. By evening, you return home and discover that someone has left another message outside your door. There is another body waiting. You stare at the message for several seconds. Your first thought is to ignore it. Your second is to remember the families who have nobody else. You pick up your equipment again. The streets are almost empty now. You walk toward the house under the light of your oil lamp, hearing only your footsteps and the occasional sound of a closing door. When you arrive, the family is waiting silently. The dead man lies in the main room, covered with a blanket. You begin preparing the water. As you work, the man's wife stands near the wall and watches you. She asks whether you are afraid. You pause for a moment before answering. You tell her that you are. She seems surprised. You explain that being afraid does not mean you can stop doing what must be done. She nods quietly. You finish the preparation and step outside. The cold night air hits your face. You wash your hands, clean the basin, and look down at your worn clothes. They are stained from days of work, and the smell of soap and smoke follows you everywhere. You finally understand that the illness is not the only thing threatening you. The constant exhaustion, cold water, poor food, and sleepless nights are slowly breaking your body down. Yet tomorrow you will probably wake to another knock. You return home, place your equipment beside the door, and lie down without even changing your clothes. Outside, the church bell continues ringing through the darkness, reminding the entire town that the dead are increasing. You close your eyes, hoping that when morning comes, you will still have enough strength to answer the next call. The seventh day begins with the church bell ringing before sunrise, but this time you do not wake immediately. Your body feels heavier than it did yesterday, and for a few moments you simply lie beneath the thin blanket, staring at the wooden ceiling above you. The fever has weakened, but the exhaustion remains. Then comes the familiar knock at the door. You already know why they have come. You slowly sit up, wash your face, and prepare your equipment. When you step outside, the town feels quieter than ever. Several shops are closed, people avoid one another in the streets, and the churchyard is filled with freshly turned earth. You follow the priest to a house near the market where an entire family has been affected by the illness. When you enter, you find an old man lying on a bed while his wife and daughter stand in the corner. The old man died during the night. You prepare the water and begin your work, but halfway through, the daughter asks you whether she will also die. You have no answer. You simply tell her to stay away from the body and wash her hands after touching anything in the room. When you finish preparing the old man, the family asks you to help carry him outside. You lift one side of the wooden board while the priest takes the other, and together you carry the body toward the churchyard. The weight is greater than you expected, and by the time you reach the cemetery your arms are shaking. You place the body beside the grave and step away while the priest begins his prayers. As you watch the grave being filled, you notice several other fresh mounds of earth nearby. Too many. You return to town and spend the afternoon visiting several homes. Some bodies belong to people you never met, while others belong to families you have already visited. One house contains a young woman who died only hours earlier. Her mother asks you to make her look beautiful for the funeral. You carefully wash her face, arrange her hair, and place her clean clothing around her. The mother watches silently and eventually tells you that her daughter had been planning to marry in the spring. You do not know what to say. You simply continue working. When you finish, the woman looks peaceful, almost as if she is sleeping. Her mother touches her cheek and begins crying. You leave the room and sit outside for a few minutes, staring at your hands. You have prepared so many bodies that the movements have become automatic, but the stories behind them never become ordinary. By evening, you are called to a larger house belonging to a wealthy family. The father has died, and several relatives have gathered despite the danger of the illness. They argue about whether the funeral should be delayed. You remain silent while they argue, because this is not your decision. Eventually, they ask you to prepare the body. The room is larger than most places you work in, with expensive furniture and candles burning along the walls, but the work remains exactly the same. You fill the basin, wash the body, clean the hair, and arrange the clothing. When you finish, the family enters one by one. The eldest son thanks you and gives you a generous payment. You put the coins away, but before leaving, you notice something unusual. Several servants are carrying buckets of water toward another room. Someone else in the house is sick. You warn the family that they should be careful, but they seem more concerned with the funeral arrangements than anything else. You leave the house as darkness falls. On your way home, you pass the market and notice that several stalls are completely empty. The streets are beginning to feel abandoned. You hear the church bell again. Another death, then another. You stop beneath the church tower and count the bells, but eventually lose track. When you finally reach your room, you discover that someone has left a small bundle of clean cloth outside your door. There is no message, only the cloth. You realize that someone in the town knows how difficult it has become for you to find clean material. You bring it inside and sit beside the table. For the first time in days, you feel something other than fear and exhaustion. Someone has remembered that you are also a human being. You wash your hands, clean your equipment, and prepare everything for tomorrow. But before going to sleep, you hear footsteps outside. Someone stops at your door. There is a long silence, followed by a quiet knock. You look toward the door and wait. A woman's voice asks whether you can come immediately. Her husband has just died. You close your eyes, take a slow breath, and reach for your basin. Another night of preparing the dead is beginning. The 8th day begins with you following the woman through the dark streets toward her home, carrying your basin and buckets while the church bells continue ringing somewhere behind you. Her husband died only an hour earlier, and she keeps looking back as if she expects someone to follow her. When you enter the house, you find the dead man lying on a simple bed beside the fire. His wife tells you that he had been sick for several days, but she does not know whether he died from the same illness spreading through the town. You ask her to leave the room while you prepare the water. She hesitates, then quietly closes the door behind her. You begin your work in silence. The room is cold despite the fire, and the only sound is the movement of water inside the wooden basin. You wash the man's hands and face, clean his hair, and carefully arrange his clothing. As you work, you notice how thin he has become during his illness. You finish preparing him and cover the body with clean cloth. When you open the door, his wife enters and stands beside the bed. She does not cry at first. She simply looks at him for a long time before placing her hand on his shoulder. You step outside and wash your equipment. Your hands are cracked from the constant washing, and the cold water makes them sting. You return home just before sunrise, but you have barely put your equipment down when another messenger arrives. A woman from the poorer part of town has died, and her family cannot afford another person to prepare her. You consider refusing, but you know exactly what will happen if nobody goes. The body will remain inside the house, and the family will have no idea what to do. You take your equipment again and follow the messenger. The house is smaller than most you have visited, with only one room and a small cooking fire. The woman's children are sitting in the corner, staring at the floor. Their mother lies beneath a blanket. You begin preparing the body while the children watch silently from the doorway. You ask their oldest brother to wait outside, but he tells you that he is afraid to leave his mother alone. You tell him that you will not hurt her and that you are only preparing her for the burial. He slowly nods and remains near the door. You work carefully, cleaning her face and hands and arranging her clothing. When you finish, the children approach the bed one by one. The oldest boy touches his mother's hand and begins crying. You look away and give them privacy. Before leaving, you give the family some of the clean cloth that was left outside your own home the previous day. You know you need it, but they need it more. The boy thanks you quietly. You leave without asking for payment. By midday, you are called to the churchyard. The priest needs help preparing several bodies that have been brought from nearby houses. You arrive and discover that the small chapel is already crowded. Several bodies are covered with cloth and placed along the walls. You immediately understand that the town is beginning to lose control of the situation. There are too many dead and too few people willing to handle them. You and the priest begin organizing the bodies one by one. You identify which families have already been contacted and which bodies still need preparation. You work for hours, stopping only to drink water. Your movements become mechanical. Washington clean, arrange, cover, repeat. By late afternoon, your arms are aching so badly that you can barely lift the basin. The priest tells you to rest, but you continue. He eventually takes the water bucket from your hands and carries it himself. You realize that he is just as exhausted as you are. When the last body has been prepared, the sun is already setting. You walk outside and sit on the stone steps of the church. The town below looks strangely empty. Smoke rises from chimneys, but there are very few people in the streets. You hear another funeral bell, followed by another. The priest sits beside you and tells you that he has never seen so many deaths in such a short time. You ask him how many people have died. He does not know anymore. You both remain silent. That evening, you return home carrying your empty basin. For the first time, you do not immediately clean your equipment. You simply place it on the floor and sit beside the table. You look at your hands and notice small cracks across the skin. You think about all the bodies you have touched during the past week, all the homes you have entered, and all the families who looked at you with fear, gratitude, or grief. You once believed that the hardest part of this work was touching the dead. Now you understand that the hardest part is walking away from the living. They are the ones who remember every face, every voice, and every empty bed. You finally clean your equipment and prepare fresh cloth for tomorrow. Before going to sleep, you hear footsteps outside your room again. This time nobody knocks. The footsteps simply continue down the street. You lie awake listening to them disappear into the darkness, wondering how many more people will still be alive when the sun rises. The ninth day begins with a silence that feels different from the previous mornings. There are fewer footsteps outside, fewer merchants calling from the market, and almost no children playing in the streets. You wake before the church bell and sit beside your bed for a long moment, wondering whether there is any point in trying to sleep again. Your body is exhausted, but your mind refuses to rest. You wash your hands, prepare your basin, and step outside. The first message waiting for you comes from the church. The priest tells you that several bodies have been brought to the chapel during the night and that their families are waiting. You follow him through the empty streets and enter the small stone building. Inside, several bodies are covered with cloth and placed along the walls. Candles burn beside them, filling the room with smoke. You begin preparing them one by one. The first is an old merchant, the second a young laborer, and the third a woman whose family cannot even enter the chapel because they are too frightened. You work quietly, washing each body and arranging the clothing as carefully as you can. By now, the movements are familiar, but the number of bodies makes everything feel different. There is barely enough clean water, and the cloth you have brought is quickly running out. You ask the priest whether anyone can bring more. He tells you that most people who usually help are either sick or afraid to come near the chapel. You continue anyway. After several hours, your hands are trembling from exhaustion. You stop beside the doorway and drink some water while looking outside. A group of people is waiting in the street. They are not waiting for food or medicine. They are waiting to find out whether their relatives are among the dead. One woman sees you and immediately approaches. She asks whether you have prepared her husband. You ask his name, and when she tells you, you realize that you have. You bring her inside and show her where he is. She stands beside him for a long time without speaking. Then she thanks you and begins crying. You step away and let her remain with him. Moments like this remind you why the work matters. You cannot bring anyone back, but you can at least make the final moments before burial more peaceful for the people who remain. Later that afternoon, the priest asks you to visit a house near the river. A fisherman has died, and his family is too frightened to touch him. When you arrive, you discover that his wife and children are sitting outside. Nobody wants to enter. You light your lamp and go inside alone. The room is cold and dark, and the dead man lies beneath a heavy blanket. You prepare the water and begin your work. While washing him, you notice an old scar across his hand. His wife later tells you that he received it years earlier while repairing a fishing net. You realize that even after death, small details remain that tell the story of a person's life. You finish preparing him and call the family inside. His youngest child stands beside the bed and asks whether his father will wake up. You have heard the question before, but it never becomes easier. You kneel beside the child and explain gently that his father has died and will not wake again. The child begins to cry. You leave the family together and step outside. As evening approaches, you return toward the center of town. On the way, you notice something that has become increasingly common. People are leaving small bowls of water and food outside their doors because they are afraid to enter the market. The streets are becoming quieter every day. You reach the church and find the priest speaking with several townsmen. They are arguing about closing the market completely. Everyone is afraid that the illness will spread further. You listen for a moment before continuing toward home. When you arrive, you find your equipment exactly where you left it. You wash the basin and cloths, but before you can finish, someone knocks. You open the door and find a young man standing outside. He tells you that his mother has died. You look at him and realize that he is barely old enough to live alone. You ask whether there is anyone else in the house. He shakes his head. You take your equipment and follow him. The house is small and almost completely dark. His mother lies beside the fireplace, covered with a blanket. The young man stands in the corner while you prepare her. He does not cry. He simply watches. When you finish, you arrange her clothing and cover her carefully. The young man approaches the bed and finally begins to cry. He tells you that she was the only family he had left. You have no words that can make the situation better, so you simply remain there for a moment. Before leaving, you help him move the body toward the door so the priest can take her to the churchyard. He thanks you and offers you several coins. You take only one and return the rest. On your way home, you realize that you are no longer thinking about how much money you earn from the work. You are thinking about how many people are being left alone. By the time you reach your room, the church bell begins ringing again. You stop in the middle of the street and listen. Another death, another family, another body waiting for you. You finally return home and sit beside your small table. Your equipment is worn, your hands are cracked, and your body feels like it belongs to someone twice your age. Yet tomorrow you know you will wake up and continue. In a town where death has become part of everyday life, someone still has to prepare the dead before they disappear beneath the earth. The 10th day begins with the church bells ringing before sunrise, but this time the sound does not stop after a few minutes. The bells continue through the morning, announcing one death after another, and you understand immediately that the town has entered a new stage of the sickness. You leave your room carrying your basin and buckets, but the streets are almost empty. Several houses have their doors marked, markets are partially closed, and people who once greeted you now step away when they see you approaching. The first call comes from a narrow house near the church. An elderly woman has died during the night, and her daughter is waiting outside because she is too frightened to enter the room. You go inside alone and prepare the body as you have done countless times before. When you finish, the daughter enters and quietly thanks you. She asks whether you can also help carry her mother to the churchyard. You agree. The body is heavier than you expect, and by the time you reach the cemetery, your arms are shaking. Several graves have already been dug nearby, and workers are struggling to keep up with the number of burials. You help place the body beside the grave before returning to the town. Your next call comes from a house belonging to a wealthy family, but wealth has done little to protect them. 2 members of the household have died, and another servant is sick. The family asks you to prepare both bodies one after another. You enter the room and begin with the older man. You wash his face and hands, clean his hair, and arrange his clothing before covering him with a fresh cloth. Then you prepare the second body. The work takes most of the afternoon, and when you finally leave the house, the family gives you a large payment. You put the coins away without much thought. Money has become almost meaningless when you are too exhausted to spend it. As you walk through the streets, you notice people carrying their belongings toward the city gates. Some families are leaving the town, hoping that the countryside will be safer. Others have nowhere to go and remain behind. You pass a group of carts loaded with furniture, sacks of grain, and clothing. A woman sees your basin and immediately pulls her children closer. You keep walking. You are no longer surprised by people's fear. They see you as someone who belongs to the world of death, even though you are still alive. By evening, you receive a message from the priest asking you to return to the chapel. When you arrive, you discover that there are more bodies than space. Several have been brought from houses across the town, and the families are waiting outside. You stand in the doorway for a moment, looking at the rows of covered bodies. Your first instinct is to turn around. There are too many, but then you hear someone crying outside. You enter. You begin with the nearest body and work slowly through the room. Washington clean. Arrange. Cover. Again and again. Hours pass. The candles burn lower, the water becomes colder, and your hands become numb. At one point, you stop and realize you cannot remember how many bodies you have prepared that day. The priest brings you another bucket of water and tells you to rest. You sit against the stone wall for a few minutes before continuing. Near midnight, the last body is finally prepared. You step outside the chapel and breathe the cold night air. The entire town seems silent. You can hear only the distant movement of carts carrying the dead toward the cemetery. You look at your hands and notice how badly the skin has cracked. There are small cuts across your fingers, and the soap burns them whenever you wash. You wrap them in cloth and begin walking home. Halfway through the street, you hear a voice calling from a nearby doorway. A man asks whether you can help his father. You stop. You tell him that you have just finished working at the chapel and need to rest. The man looks at you for a moment and says that his father has been dead since the previous evening. Nobody else will come. You look toward your home, then back at the man. You know what you are going to do before you answer. You follow him inside. The house is small, and the dead man lies in a simple bed near the fire. The family has already placed candles around him. You prepare the water one more time. Your movements are slower now, but you remain careful. You wash his face, hands, and hair, then arrange his clothing and cover him with clean cloth. When you finish, the man's son thanks you and offers you a few coins. You accept them because refusing would embarrass him. As you step outside, dawn is beginning to appear on the horizon. You realize that you have worked through the entire night. The town is slowly waking, but you have not slept. You return to your room, place the coins on the table, and sit beside them. You do not even have the strength to remove your boots. Before lying down, you look at the equipment beside the door. The basin is scratched, the cloths are worn, and the wooden handles of the buckets are beginning to break. Everything you own is slowly falling apart. You lie down and close your eyes, but the church bell begins ringing again. Another death has come before you have even fallen asleep. You stare at the ceiling and realize that the town may soon have more dead than living people willing to care for them. The 11th day begins without any real sleep. You have barely closed your eyes when the church bells start ringing again, and this time you do not even try to count them. You sit on the edge of your bed, exhausted, with your hands wrapped in old cloth because the cracks in your skin have become painful. For a moment, you consider staying inside. You have spent more than a week walking into houses filled with sickness and preparing the dead while barely eating or sleeping yourself. But then someone knocks at your door. A young priest stands outside and tells you that the churchyard is full and several families are waiting. You gather your equipment and follow him. The streets are almost deserted, and the silence is broken only by carts moving slowly toward the cemetery. When you reach the churchyard, you see several bodies waiting beneath simple cloth coverings. There are not enough people to carry them, and the gravediggers are exhausted. You begin preparing the first body inside the small chapel. It belongs to an old woman whose family has already left the town. Nobody is waiting for her, so you work alone. You wash her face and hands, arrange her hair, and cover her with clean cloth. When you finish, you stand beside her for a moment before moving to the next body. The second belongs to a young man who worked at the market. His brother is waiting outside and asks you to make him look as peaceful as possible. You do your best. When you finish, the brother enters and places a small wooden cross beside him. He thanks you and walks away without saying anything else. You continue through the morning, preparing one body after another. By midday, your stomach is empty and your legs are trembling, but there is still work waiting. The priest brings you bread and tells you to eat. You sit on the chapel steps and force yourself to finish it. It is hard, dry bread, but it is enough to keep you moving. After the short break, you are called to a house on the edge of town. A family has lost their father, and they are terrified because they believe the sickness has returned to their home. When you arrive, you notice that the man's wife has already moved the children into another room. You enter alone. The body lies beside the fireplace, covered with a blanket. You begin your work quietly. The room is cold, and the fire has almost gone out. You wash the man's face and hands, clean his hair, and arrange his clothing. When you finish, you leave the room and tell the family that they can enter. The wife looks at her husband and begins crying. She asks whether she did enough for him before he died. You tell her that she stayed beside him, and sometimes that is all a person can do. She thanks you. Before leaving, you give her a small piece of clean cloth because she has nothing suitable to cover him. You continue toward the center of town as the sun begins to fall. On the way, you notice that several houses have been completely abandoned. Doors stand open, belongings remain inside, and weeds are beginning to grow around the entrances. The sickness has changed the town. Places that were once full of voices now feel empty. You reach the market and discover that only a few merchants remain. One of them recognizes you and gives you a small bag of food without asking for payment. You thank him and continue walking. For the first time in days, you realize that some people still see you as something more than the person who comes when someone dies. By evening, you return to the churchyard. Several new graves have been dug, and the gravediggers are struggling to keep up. The priest asks you to help prepare the bodies before the burial begins. You enter the chapel again. There are 4 bodies waiting. You look at them and feel an overwhelming exhaustion. You want to sit down and refuse, but then you remember that each body represents a family waiting outside. You begin again. The first takes almost an hour. The second is faster. By the third, your hands are moving almost automatically. When you reach the fourth, your fingers begin shaking so badly that you have to stop. You close your eyes, take a breath, and continue. When the final body is ready, you step outside into the cold evening air. The priest is standing beside the cemetery wall. He tells you that the number of deaths appears to be decreasing in some parts of town. You do not allow yourself to believe it yet. Too many times you have heard hopeful news followed by another wave of funerals. Still, for the first time in days, the bells become quieter as the night progresses. You return home carrying your empty basin. You wash your hands, clean the remaining cloths, and place your equipment beside the door. Then you finally sit down to eat the small amount of food given to you at the market. You are so tired that you almost fall asleep at the table. Before going to bed, you look outside your window. The streets are still quiet, but there are a few people walking again. A merchant opens his shop. Someone lights a lantern. A child runs across the street. Tiny signs of ordinary life are beginning to return. You lie down beneath your blanket and close your eyes. The church bell rings once in the distance. Only once. You listen carefully, waiting for another. None comes. For the first time in many nights, you fall asleep without knowing whether you will be called before morning. The 12th day begins differently from all the days before it. There is no knock at your door before sunrise, no frightened messenger waiting outside, and no funeral bell filling the streets. You wake naturally, confused by the silence, and for several moments you simply lie there listening. Then you sit up and look toward the window. The town is still quiet, but there are signs that something has changed. A merchant is opening his shop across the street. A baker is carrying baskets toward his oven. 2 children are walking together near the market. Life has not returned completely, but it is beginning to move again. You get out of bed and look at the equipment beside your door. The basin is scratched and stained, the wooden buckets are damaged, and almost every piece of cloth you own has been used. You wash your hands and begin cleaning everything carefully. For the first time in many days, you are cleaning your equipment without knowing that you will immediately need it again. When you finish, you walk toward the church. The priest is standing outside the cemetery, looking over the fresh graves. He tells you that there were no new deaths during the night. You are not sure how to react. After so many days of hearing the bells, the silence feels almost frightening. You walk through the cemetery and look at the rows of new graves. Some belong to people you prepared yourself. Others belong to people whose names you never learned. You remember their faces, their families, the rooms where they died, and the small details that remained after their lives had ended. You realize that while the town may eventually forget many of these deaths, you will carry some of them with you for the rest of your life. Later that morning, a family comes to the church and asks whether you can prepare an elderly man who died peacefully in his sleep. You agree. It is the first body you have prepared in several days without fear of an unknown illness. You enter the house, and the atmosphere is completely different from the homes you visited during the sickness. There is sadness, but there is no panic. The family has already prepared clean clothing and warm water. You begin your work slowly. You wash the man's hands and face, clean his hair, and arrange his clothes. When you finish, his children enter the room and stand beside him. One of them thanks you for everything you have done during the past weeks. You are surprised that they know. You tell them that you were only doing your work. The man smiles sadly and says that someone still had to do it when everyone else was too afraid. You leave the house carrying your empty basin. On the way back, you notice more people returning to the streets. The market begins filling again. Carts move between the houses, shopkeepers open their doors, and the sound of ordinary conversation slowly replaces the silence that had taken over the town. You stop near the market and watch for a few minutes. Nobody is running. Nobody is shouting about another death. Nobody is waiting outside the church for news. It feels almost like the town you knew before, but you know it will never be exactly the same. You have seen how quickly an ordinary street can become empty, how quickly a family can disappear, and how quickly people begin fearing the very person they need. In the afternoon, you return to your small room and count the coins you have earned. There is not much. Despite all the bodies you prepared, you are still poor. You still have the same small room, the same worn clothes, and the same damaged equipment. Your work has not made you wealthy. It has not given you respect or a better place in society. People will still move away from you when they see your buckets. Children will still whisper about what you do. Some families will still refuse to shake your hand. But something has changed inside you. You no longer feel the same fear when someone mentions death. You have learned that your work is not really about the dead. It is about the living people who remain behind. You were there when mothers lost children, when husbands lost wives, when families stood beside empty beds, and when frightened people needed someone to make the final moments a little more peaceful. As evening approaches, you walk toward the church one final time. The sun is setting behind the rooftops, covering the cemetery in warm light. You place your basin beside the wall and sit quietly for a few minutes. The graves are silent. The town beyond them is beginning to breathe again. You think about the first morning when you answered the church bell and how you believed every death was simply another task. Now you understand that every body belonged to someone. Every grave represented a story, and every family you entered would remember you long after you left. You stand up, collect your equipment, and begin walking home. The streets are no longer empty. People are talking, candles are burning behind windows, and somewhere in the distance a child is laughing. You pass the cemetery without stopping. Tomorrow there may be another body. There may be another family calling your name. Your work will never completely disappear because people will always die, and someone will always have to prepare them for their final journey. But tonight, for the first time in many days, you return home without hearing the funeral bell behind you. You close your door, place your basin against the wall, and sit beside the small window. Outside, the medieval town continues living, and for one quiet night, you are allowed to live with it.